The Transfiguration of Jesus. This mystical occurrence on a mountaintop that seems way too strange to wrap our heads around. Didn't Jesus tell the disciples not to share this story? And here it is. In my mind, any attempt to figure this out falls short. And while this can be said of much in the life of Jesus, the miracles, well, they serve a purpose, right? People are fed, people are healed. The death and resurrection of Jesus, paramount to our faith. But the transfiguration of Jesus, what gives? So let's journey up the mountain and do some exploring. But before we go there, let's take a peek at what comes before this trek. The 6 days before Jesus leads Peter, James, and John high into the mountain range. Jesus and his disciples had been hanging out in nearby villages, and questions about Jesus' identity were coming up. People were struggling to figure out just who this Jesus is. But Peter, he confidently declares that Jesus is the Messiah, the one that they've been waiting for. In turn, Jesus begins to teach of his impending death and resurrection. Only the disciples, they don't get it, or they don't want to hear it. To the point that Peter takes Jesus aside and says, "Yeah, I don't think so, Jesus." And it's after all of this that Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up the mountain, where things get downright weird. At the top of the mountain, Jesus is transfigured. We're told his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. Other accounts of this instance add that the appearance of Jesus' face changed, that it shone like the sun. There is something physically different about Jesus, and it's connected to brightness, it's connected to light. Then Moses and Elijah appear, 2 prophets of old, long gone from the earth, and they talk with Jesus. And Peter, James, and John are understandably freaked out. The word that is used is terrified. They are terrified at what they're experiencing. And Peter utters the first thing that comes to his mind: "Let's pitch 3 tents, one for each of you." Now, this may seem like a really strange thing to say, but there is a sense that Peter is convinced that this is it. That this is the culmination of Jesus' mission. That this is the fulfillment of the Messiah, not that whole suffering and death thing Jesus was talking about. And while still terrifying, this makes sense to Peter. The dazzling white, the appearance of prophets, the mountaintop experience. There was no way things were going to be the same after this. As if on cue, a large cloud overshadows them, and from the cloud a voice: "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." In the midst of their fear, God responds. God responds and directs their attention back to Jesus, and affirming, as was done at Jesus' baptism, that he is the Son, the beloved, they are to listen to him, because there's more to come. This isn't it, after all. The tents aren't necessary because they aren't going to stay on the mountaintop. Peter, James, and John, they blink, and this mind-blowing experience is over. Only Jesus is left, and he looks the way they're used to seeing him, and he leads them down the mountain, telling them to tell no one about what they've seen until the Son of Man has risen from the dead, that is. Now you'd think that after all this, they'd get it. Then an experience like this would make accepting the unthinkable possible. But that doesn't happen. The very next verse in Mark's gospel account reads, "So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead could mean." Okay, so this is what's happened. The next question is what to make of it all. Clearly, the disciples listened to Jesus and shared this story after his resurrection, but to what end? Novelist Mary Gordon offers that as a transfigured body, clothed in shining garments, Jesus insists upon being seen, which means that for us, the Transfiguration narrative can be read as the celebration of the visible. The celebration of the visible. On that mountaintop, Jesus is visible to his friends as the fulfillment of the prophets and the beloved Son of God. A glimpse of the light of the world shining in the darkness. But this is incomplete. It's in the death and resurrection of Jesus and in the hope of his coming again that the light of the world shines bright for all to see. That's when the disciples begin to share this experience. It's only then that they can begin to make sense of the role that they play in making God's love known in the world. And the only way to participate in this is to allow themselves to be made visible by Christ's light. Because this is how the gospel of Jesus spreads, the light of Christ making all things visible, transforming everything in the love of God. Now you think that this would be a moths to a flame situation. Who wouldn't want all things transformed in God's love? That sounds pretty great. But the celebration of the visible, it means that nothing's hidden. The cracks in the foundation are revealed. There's no more sweeping the hard stuff under the table or pretending it doesn't exist. Whether that's our insecurity and high-functioning anxiety manifesting as over-functioning, the sheer overwhelm of trying to navigate the complexities of the world around us, or our desire to go it alone in the struggle. The loss of a job, the illness, the broken relationship, all because the vulnerability of letting someone in is too scary. All of this is made visible. In her new book, Have a Beautiful, Terrible Day, author Kate Bowler writes this: "The hard truth is that the most basic aspect of our humanity is not our determination, our talents, or whatever we accomplished during last year's resolutions. We are united by our fragility." She goes on to invite us to reclaim the word precarity, to reclaim this word as a way of understanding how to navigate life in our shared fragility. Now, while precarity means a state of dangerous uncertainty, Bowler shares that its Latin root tells us about its Christian character. She says the term comes from precarious, or obtained by entreaty or prayer, a state where we cannot achieve things by ourselves. We must rely on someone else, God or neighbor. Which in her words means that instead of saying that we are self-mastering winners, beautiful cyborgs who can somehow rule our worlds by our own determination, we can admit truths that are much more realistic. How are we? Dependent. How are we doing? Fine, until we need help, which will be in roughly 2 or 3 minutes. What if the celebration of the visible is the celebration of our fragility? What if the celebration of the visible is the celebration that while we may not all know what it feels like to succeed, whether we're willing to admit it or not, we all know what it feels like to mess up, to make a mistake, to not have it all figured out. On that mountaintop, Peter, James, and John really had no clue what they were witnessing. It was an otherworldly, divine encounter, yet God comes close in Jesus among them. But on the cross, fragile, exposed, in pain, what Jesus experiences there, that's about as human as it gets. Pain and fragility, we know that. And God comes close in Jesus here too. You see, it's not one or the other. It's both and. The celebration of the visible can't happen without the cross. The Transfiguration can't be shared apart from Good Friday. Because together they show us the one who knows the depth of pain and the brilliance of overwhelming love. This is what we are invited to live into. This is where we pitch our tents. In the truth of our shared fragility, caught up in the mystery of God's celebratory glory. For this is where Jesus insists upon being seen.